This episode is sponsored by the book. High above the jungles of Vietnam, a single Fairchild C-130 provider, with every rivet and bolt straining to hold the old girl together, dove steeply through the smoke and intense ground fire towards Kham Duc. In a desperate last-minute attempt, her crew plunged towards a shattered runway below, an almost hopeless effort to rescue a three-man combat control team stranded and pinned down by heavy enemy fire. The radios, filled just moments before with chatter from dozens of circling aircraft, fell silent as all eyes turned towards the lumbering beast dropping towards certain doom. No one was sure if they were witnessing a rescue or a final act of sacrifice. This is the story of the Battle of Kham Duc and its heroic evacuation during the Vietnam War. It's a story of chaos, courage, and the men who refused to quit even when all seemed lost. But before we begin this epic tale, I want to say a few words about the Battle of Kham Duc and its evacuation. It was a chaotic and very complex event, and to be clear, in this video I don't aim to cover every twist and turn, but instead focus on the most critical moments between the 6th and 12th of May 1968. A bit of background on how this particular video came about. It started as a chapter in my C-130 provider episode, and while working on that video, I just felt that this slice of history was just too important to have as part of something else. I felt it deserved its own standalone episode, not buried deep inside another video where it may not have gotten the attention it deserves, because believe me, this story is something else, especially the ending. Perhaps one day someone will make a film about these events, because in my opinion, the actions of the men on the ground and the crews of the US Air Force helicopter and transports over those few short days are nothing short of heroic and deserve to be immortalized. You wouldn't glance twice at Kham Duc on a map. It was just a speck tucked away in a narrow valley in Vietnam's Central Highlands, 10 miles from the Laos border and about 45 air miles west of Chu Lai on the coast. Kham Duc sat right at the edge of South Vietnam's northernmost tactical zone, 1st Corps, or commonly referred to as I Corps, and it was the last American outpost keeping eyes on the Ho Chi Minh Trail after Lang Vây fell during the Tet Offensive of 1968. The camp itself wasn't much to look at, just a scattering of low-weathered buildings, a few bunkers, and a 6,200-foot airstrip running northeast to southwest, sitting beside National Highway 14 that also ran parallel with the border with Laos. The airstrip had been laid down back in the 1950s by French colonial forces and later used by President Diem to fly in for hunting trips. But in the 1960s, the US military expanded the base and attempted to improve its defenses, laying down barbed fences and concertina wires with claymore mines to protect the airfield. The camp's inner defenses were a rough network of zigzagging trenches about 4 feet deep, running around the main compound and protected with mortars and machine guns. But Kham Duc sat beyond the range of US artillery support, and its defences were light, barely enough to hold off a sustained determined attack. That narrow strip of tarmac was the camp's only real lifeline, the only way in or out. The roads were unsecured, the jungle too thick, and the overland routes were far too dangerous for any regular resupply. But the terrain didn't make it easy flying into Kham Duc. The valley was barely 2 miles long and 1.5 miles wide, and hemmed in on all sides by steep, jungle-choked hills climbing up to 5,000 feet, with the Dak Mi River over a mile away. From this jungle bowl, US Special Forces had begun launching recon missions into Laos in early 1965, hoping to slow the flow of men and material heading south to fuel the war. But the base soon became too small, with the Special Forces launch site moving to Khe Sanh and new bases being established elsewhere. By the end of 1966, Kham Duc was no longer part of Special Forces' bigger picture and was used primarily as a civilian irregular defense group training site and occasional launches of reconnaissance commando teams into Laos. For pilots, flying in was a gamble because Kham Duc, the weather always had the final word. The valley sat at the crossroads of two monsoon systems. Northeasterly winds from the coast met heavier southwesterly spilling in from Laos. With the weather clashing across both sides of Annamite Range, Kham Duc developed a brutal microclimate, averaging over 277 inches of rainfall a year. Morning ground fog was almost a daily occurrence, hanging low in the valley until it was burned off by the sun. One moment sunshine, the next 10,000 feet of cloud cover and super thick fog that grounded air support and cut the camp off entirely. Even in the dry season, aircraft were turned around or forced to circle until fuel dictated otherwise. That isolation meant that for the Americans, every bullet, ration and reinforcement depended on the weather that could, and often did, shut them out. For the North Vietnamese, it was a window. It offered a tactical advantage, a chance to strike while the camp was cut off and hit it hard before help could get through. In March 1968, US intel had started to notice large NVA troop movements and road building activity connecting the Laos supply lines to Highway 14 just south of Kham Duc. As a precaution, troops were positioned at the small forward operating base at Ngoc Tu Vac, 5 miles south of Kham Duc, to keep an eye on this activity. We shall return to Ngoc Tu Vac in a bit. The Americans responded fast. Under a Tactical Emergency Airlift Priority, the highest military assistance command Vietnam or MACV could assign, they began flying in reinforcements. A battalion task force from the Americal Division arrived, over 600 troops with artillery, ammo and orders to dig in. By the start of May, the headcount at Kham Duc had swelled to over 1,700 people, special forces, engineers, marines, air force personnel, locally trained indigenous troops called the CIDG, and nearly 300 Vietnamese civilians, mostly families of the indigenous fighters. In fact, 85% of Kham Duc's civilian population were dependents of the CIDG strike force. The perimeter was expanded, foxholes were dug deeper, wire was laid, firing lanes were cleared, and the engineers worked around the clock to upgrade the airstrip and install TACAN and ground-controlled approach systems to handle heavy aircraft in bad weather. So the question is, why Kham Duc? On the surface, it was just a backwater outpost, but to the leadership at Hanoi, it was a strategic bullseye. On the surface, it appeared that they wanted to force MACV's hand and draw US forces away from coastal strongholds like Da Nang. The bet was simple: hit Kham Duc hard, make it look like it's about to fall, and the Americans would scramble troops west to save it, filling out defences where it really mattered. But the real objective was bigger. The Paris peace talks were set to begin on May the 13th, and the NVA wanted a win, not just on the battlefield but on a global stage. The plan was to overrun the camp, kill or capture as many Americans in sight and film the whole thing. It was already known that in early April, a small unit from the People's Army of Vietnam Film Studio in Hanoi had travelled down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to join up with the NVA 2nd Division to record the US and South Vietnamese Army prisoners being led away, hands tied behind their backs. In the book Bait, The Battle of Kham Duc, James McLeroy and Gregory Sanders stopped short of claiming that Hanoi intended to stage a Dien Bien Phu-style propaganda victory, but they note that the official history of the NVA 2nd Division mirrors the structure of Dien Bien Phu, suggesting that the North Vietnamese may have seen a symbolic value in replicating that battle. That defeat had shattered political support for the war and hastened France's withdrawal from Indochina. Given the timing just before the Paris peace talks, it is possible that Hanoi had hoped for a propaganda win that could influence global opinion and pressure US leaders at the negotiating table. With support from their communist Chinese allies, Hanoi aimed to stir the communist parties abroad, fuel anti-war demonstrations, and sway public opinion in the US, counting on sympathetic activists to pressure Congress through a media already turning against the war. For the battle, based on post-event analysis, Hanoi was banking on three things. First, that the indigenous CIDG fighters, many of them barely trained, unwilling to fight, and with no loyalty to anybody, would crack under pressure. Second, that the weather would ground US air power at a critical moment. And third, that the two regiments, estimated at between 3,000 to 4,000 NVA troops, depending if they were at full strength or not, could overrun the camp before the weather cleared, enough for the US to attack, resupply or evacuate. So the question would be, which side would the weather gods favour? Before we crack on, I want to take a moment to talk about this video's sponsor who made this episode possible, so a big thank you goes out to them. Ever wonder what you'd actually do if civilization collapsed? No power, no internet, no Google, and heaven forbid no tea or biscuits. Just you, a few dazed survivors, and the smouldering ashes of the modern world. Would you know where to start? Do you know how to make fire, find water, build a steam engine? Well, I would, because I fully intend to become King Joe of London. How? Because I have the book. It's not just a survival guide, it's an engineering master plan for rebuilding civilization. Over 400 pages with 180 essential topics across 23 chapters: fire, medicine, metalworking, fuel, engines, and even flight. Yeah, there's even an entire section on building actual aircraft, wings, propellers, control surfaces, all in beautifully hand-drawn detail. This thing is gorgeously made. Premium matte art paper, medieval meets engineering illustrations, and a hardcover that looks like something you'd find in a wizard's workshop. It's not just a book, it's a work of art. A top Kickstarter bestseller and a perfect gift for anyone who geeks out over science, engineering, history, or just likes rebuilding stuff. With input from more than 50 professionals, engineers, scientists, artists, and more. So, want one? When you scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description, you get 10% off your copy. Because surviving is fine, but wouldn't you prefer rebuilding and declaring yourself supreme leader of a post-apocalyptic world? So a big thank you to the book for sponsoring this video. Now back to the story. 5 miles southwest of Kham Duc was a small forward operating base of Noktovac. This position was defended by a 120-man strike force made up of indigenous troops, along with 8 US Special Forces soldiers and 3 Australian advisors. Since Noktovac was outside friendly artillery range, 33 Marine artillerymen with 2 105mm howitzers were also located at the outpost. However, Noktovac's position, surrounded by high jungle-covered terrain on the south side of a small valley on Highway 14, made it very vulnerable to attack. The North Vietnamese army began probing Noktovac on the 6th of May 1968 with mortar barrages and ground assaults, signalling the start of a coordinated offensive in the region. By May the 9th, after days of relentless shelling and enemy attacks, the situation was becoming dire. The defenders, running low on ammunition, faced an estimated 2 NVA regiments. A desperate attempt by CIDG forces to retreat to Kham Duc along Highway 14 ended up in a deadly ambush, forcing survivors back to Noktovac. The main assault came early on May the 10th. At first light, the NVA unleashed heavy mortar and direct rocket fire on the base, once again followed by a frontal attack. The defenders faced a shocking betrayal when Vietnamese infiltrators dressed as Kham Duc CIDG soldiers approached the Marine section of the compound shouting, don't shoot, friendly, friendly," before launching a grenade and satchel charge and small arms attack, inflicting heavy casualties. The use of carbines, weapons carried by the CIDG forces, led the Americans to suspect that some of their indigenous allies had turned on them, sowing distrust. Now, I just want to mention very quickly, I know some of you are going to say it's pronounced carbines rather than carbines, but I'll let you guys fight it out in the comments. The arrival of an AC-47 Spooky gunship provided a lifeline. Its 3 7.62mm miniguns, each firing between 50 and 100 rounds per second, strafed the perimeter wire and surrounding brush, breaking up enemy concentrations and killing numerous NVA soldiers, some within the overrun sections of the camp. By 0830, F-4 Phantoms, guided by forward air controllers and O-1 or O-2 aircraft, joined the fight, delivering 500-pound bombs, napalm and cannon fire. Despite this support, the defenders, with only 2 105mm howitzers and 4 mortars, fired their last 100 artillery rounds and disabled their weapons, relying on rifles and air support to hold out. With reinforcements unable to reach Noktovac, and the camp on the brink of being overrun, the decision to evacuate was made late that morning. After destroying their equipment with a claymore mine, the survivors, assisted by fighters which dropped napalm to clear a path, moved southeast through the jungle, avoiding open areas. They made it to a hill a mile from the fort, where they hacked out a landing zone where 4 Marine CH-46 helicopters made multiple shuttle runs to Kham Duc, all the time under intense ground fire. By 1900 hours on May the 10th, all the survivors were airlifted to Kham Duc, where an aid station was established. Engineers and Special Forces medics treated the 52 wounded from Nukhtavak and prepared them for evacuation. Those stable enough to be moved were flown out on the 11th by Chinook helicopters and the C-7A Caribou. Those who couldn't be evacuated on May the 11th faced a brutal second ordeal the next day, as the communist forces that had struck Nukhtavak advanced those few miles to join their comrades in the attack on Kham Duc. The losses were unfortunately heavy: 15 Americans dead, 14 Marines, 1 Army, 52 wounded, 21 Marines, 2 Army, 29 CIDG, and 64 missing. The NVA had the momentum, the high ground, and the initiative. The Americans still held the camp, but everyone knew that the real assault hadn't even begun. While the battle was going on at Nukhtavak, the NVA had been attacking Kham Duc since the 10th of May, hitting the base with mortars and recoilless rifles from the high ground around the base, where they had clear lines of sight on the runway and any aircraft. The mortar bombardment began early and would continue throughout the day. It came in waves, 10 to 15 minutes of heavy shelling, followed by an hour or more of uneasy silence, and then more explosions. West of Kham Duc, a UH-1C gunship was shot down by anti-aircraft fire, ominous evidence that the NVA were positioning .51 caliber weapons, known as chopper killers, in the surrounding high ground. Fortunately, the pilot of the helicopter managed to land safely. True, the terrain made it impossible for the NVA to bring in heavy artillery, but that didn't mean they weren't preparing to tighten the noose. The seriousness of the threat became undeniable when on the 11th of May a captured NVA soldier revealed that his unit was preparing to launch a ground attack on Kham Duc. After much vacillation between reinforcing the camp before it was completely overrun and evacuating it, Lieutenant General Robert E. Cushman Jr., commander of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, or MAF, recommended to General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV, that Kham Duc be evacuated. Finally, late on May the 11th, Westmoreland agreed, ordering the withdrawal on the grounds that the camp lacked the defensive potential of Khe Sanh and no longer held any military or political significance. With the decision to abandon Kham Duc now made, it didn't reach everyone in time. Although the Special Forces teams at Kham Duc got word in the early hours of the 12th that the camp would be evacuated later that day, the 834th Air Division, the command responsible for all US Air Force airlift in Vietnam, wasn't informed until 0800 hours. As a result, many of the aircrews flying in Kham Duc in the C-130s and C-123s that morning still believed they were on routine resupply missions, not about to land in the middle of a full-scale evacuation under fire. The confusion didn't stop there. Ground units, helicopters and fixed-winged aircraft all operated on different radio systems. PRC-25s, UHF, VHF, none of it was unified. Commanders talked over each other, crowding the airwaves just when clarity mattered most. In the early morning hours of the 12th, the 7 outposts that also ringed the main camp, each fortified with concrete bunkers, machine guns and coils of concertina wire, manned by American and CIDG troops, each came under attack. To give you an idea how ferocious the fighting had become, in a desperate moment before being overrun, at 0430 hours, the defenders of Outpost 3 radioed in a request for an AC-47 Spooky gunship to fire directly on their own position to halt the enemy assault. Soon after, at 0530 hours, the defenders of Outpost 1 made a similar call, also to the crew of the Spooky gunship overhead, asking them to zero in on their position and fire to blast away their attackers. But the numbers of the NVA were too much for the defenders, who at 0630 hours were ordered to pull back to the main camp. Now, with all the outlying positions lost, a growing sense of dread settled over Kham Duc. From their elevated jungle-covered positions, the communists could fire directly down into the camp and at any aircraft attempting to resupply or evacuate it. As the sun broke over the horizon, the usual thick morning fog settled over the base. Shrouded by mist, the North Vietnamese regiments launched a massive ground attack on the southeastern perimeter, using the poor visibility and terrain to conceal their advance. But point-blank artillery, airstrikes and small arms fire broke up the assault. But before it ended, a new attack began at the opposite side of the base, confirming that the camp was fully surrounded. At 0820 hours, General Bill McLaughlin, commander of the 834th Air Division, was ordered by the US 7th Air Force to make an all-out effort to evacuate Kham Duc. 10 minutes later, commander of the 7th Air Force, General Momeyer, initiated Grand Slam, a code name typically reserved for maximum effort assaults north of the demilitarized zone. It signaled an all-out multi-service offensive unleashing overwhelming firepower. It was now a full-blown emergency. Every available aircraft, from fighters and bombers to helicopters stationed as far away as Thailand, was scrambled to stem or at least stall the North Vietnamese onslaught long enough to get people out. There was brief talk of salvaging equipment, but with the base under fire, that idea was quickly abandoned. Just after 0800 hours, the first helicopter, a US Army CH-47 Chinook, commanded by Captain Sturdivant, arrived to begin the evacuation, but it never made it out. It took several hits to the number 1 engine from communist guns, now positioned in outpost number 7. The big twin-rotor helicopter burst into flames mid-hover and hit the ground. Fortunately, the crew managed to escape out the back ramp before it exploded in a fireball that scattered wreckage across the runway. A pilot of one of the nearby helicopter gunships who saw the incident was quoted later as saying that the ground fire just ate him up. Now, with the burning helicopter blocking the runway, no heavy transports could land. The runway was effectively shut. As the first CH-47 Chinook went down in flames, an Air Force A-1E Skyraider, flown by Major James Swain, was hit while laying down napalm and cluster bombs across the ridgeline above the base. Swain managed to eject, but as he drifted down through the air, he came under heavy enemy fire. With no time to spare, an Army UH-1 Minuteman Slick, a lightly armed transport Huey, moved in for a rescue. Warrant Officer Ed Fitzsimmons, the pilot of the Minuteman Slick, radioed in, "I'll go down and get him, I'll go down and get him, you follow me," while 2 UH-1C helicopter gunships already on station swung around to provide cover. Both had already taken multiple hits during earlier runs but stayed in the fight, circling the descending pilot as he hung exposed in his parachute, taking fire from nearly every direction. One gunship crew later said they were amazed he survived. The situation on the ground was dire. One of the gunship pilots later estimated there were at least 2 companies of North Vietnamese troops in the area, calling them like ants down there, popping out from behind trees and taking pot shots, too many targets to suppress completely. The gunships held position and poured fire into the tree line, keeping enemy heads down long enough for the Huey to make its approach. Once Fitzsimmons was on the ground, the door gunner sprinted over to Swain, who had just touched down under fire. He slashed through the parachute cords with his knife, dragged the pilot to the helicopter and bodily tossed him inside, and they lifted off before the enemy could regroup. The gunships escorted the Slick out of the kill zone, taking fire as they pulled away from what one pilot described as looking like something out of a World War II movie. There were wrecked aircraft burning on the runway, plumes of smoke in and around the base, with bullets and tracers flying through the air from every direction. The 3 helicopters stayed on station for a full 45 minutes before being finally ordered to stand down. They'd taken significant damage, and the intensity of the enemy fire made another run too risky. When they tried to refuel and head back in, they were denied clearance due to their battered condition and rising threat level. Just after the Skyraider pilot was rescued, one of the UH-1s was shot down, but the pilot managed to auto-rotate into the base perimeter near the airstrip, landing hard, sideways and on fire. Fearing he was trapped, personnel on the ground ran to the wreck and yanked him out through the cockpit window, dragging him into a nearby bunker just moments before incoming mortar rounds pounded the smouldering helicopter. Despite the growing danger, the rescue and medevac flights continued through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. Since the operation wasn't pre-planned, there was no overarching helicopter control to coordinate the evacuation. An Air Force Airborne Command and Control Center aircraft had arrived on station around 0900 hours, directing the arriving fighter bombers to the FACs, flying a mix of O-1 Bird Dogs and O-2 Skymasters. These guided attacks to bomb, strafe and suppress the communists, most of them making up to 8 ordnance delivery passes over their targets, buying the defenders a small window of time. But there was a problem. The ABCCC had no experience with helicopters, and worse, lacked the right radios to talk to most of them. To fill the vacuum, Major Todd of the 14th Combat Aviation Battalion took the initiative. Operating under the call sign Arab 03, he used the UHF frequency assigned to the Assault Support Helicopter Company to direct helicopter traffic in and out of Kham Duc. From his UH-1, Arab 03 could talk to the ground troops and the FACs, and because of his altitude, he had a clear view of known enemy positions and the safest approach routes. When he had to leave for fuel, a CH-47 pilot, Boxcar 23, took over. The two alternated control duties throughout the day. Arab 03 and Boxcar 23 became the de facto traffic controllers, talking pilots in, guiding them to evacuees and keeping track of who made it out. Still, not every crew made contact. Either they were on the wrong frequency or Arab 03 was too busy on another net. One Marine pilot described the scene as having no real coordination agency. He couldn't reach the ABCCC, whose C-130 was using incompatible radios, and believed he was flying blind, just landing where he hoped evacuees might be. So helicopter crews bitched and cursed about all the confusion and chaos, but they performed professionally, ultimately rescuing over 700 people, while the rest waited for the transports to arrive. At around 10 AM that morning, Specialist Dan Hostler, using a bulldozer, worked under constant enemy fire to clear the wreckage of the downed Chinook from the runway. As soon as the helicopter was cleared, a C-130 flown by Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Cole wasted no time in making his approach, where it was immediately pounded by enemy guns. They landed at Kham Duc in a hail of mortar fire, touching down on a runway strewn with debris that blew out one of the tyres. The aircraft took many hits, with shrapnel ripping through its right-wing fuel tanks. The crew that had flown out of Cam Ranh Bay had no idea they were stepping into a firefight, much less a full-blown extraction under fire. Symbolic of the chaos engulfing Kham Duc was the desperate surge of Vietnamese civilians and irregular troops towards this first C-130, leaping out of ditches by the side of the runway and swarming the aircraft. The panicked civilians rushed aboard and wouldn't move, so the aircraft couldn't be unloaded. The plane was effectively stuck, and the longer it sat on the ground, the more it became a magnet for enemy fire. Cole, the aircraft commander, made the difficult decision to try to take off anyway, carrying both the desperate passengers and the full cargo they had flown in with. But it was too much, with fuel leaking from the damaged fuel tank, plus the weight far exceeding safe limits, and that blown tyre, the C-130 simply couldn't lift off. Cole therefore aborted the takeoff and taxied back to the apron, and the passengers quickly figured out that they were sitting targets in the aircraft, and they finally got off, returning to the ditch at the side of the runway. Knowing they needed to remove the damaged tyre to attempt another takeoff, the crew pulled out a bayonet and started taking in turns hacking at the rubber, but the steel beading proved impossible to sever with the blade. The crew managed to find a blowtorch, and they carefully started to cut through the steel cords, keeping a fire extinguisher close at hand just in case the magnesium wheel ignited. While Cole and the engineers were hacking away the damaged tyre, another pilot made his approach. Major Ray Shelton brought his C-123K into Kham Duc and quickly loaded 65 more evacuees, 44 Army engineers and 21 Vietnamese civilians. The enemy fire was so intense, mortar shells were landing in every direction, yet Shelton was on the ground for less than 3 minutes before getting back into the air. At 10:30 hours, despite the runway now being cleared of the remains of the Chinook, the 7th Air Force radioed that it was completely unfeasible to carry out any further evacuations by cargo aircraft, reversing its decision of several hours earlier. Instead, the 834th Airlift Command and Control Center was told to prepare their C-130s and the C-123s for a massive airdrop of ammunition into Kham Duc. However, when a mortar landed a few dozen yards from where Cole and his crew were standing, too close for comfort for him, he realized that despite the order to halt evacuations, it was now only a matter of minutes before the enemy zeroed in on them. Fortunately, by that point, Cole and his crew and the engineers had finally removed the damaged tyre. With no time left, Cole chose to attempt another takeoff, this time with just 3 of the 4 engines running. The number 1 engine, the one that was closest to the fuel leaks, was not started until they reached the runway due to fears of igniting the leak in fuel. Taxiing was treacherous. A disabled truck blocked part of the ramp, and the aircraft had to carefully roll over loose cargo and debris without clipping anything with the spinning propellers. Just as the aircraft aligned for takeoff, 2 mortar shells exploded so close that the right-hand side cockpit windows shattered from the concussion. Now Cole faced not only a missing tyre and leaking fuel, but also a dangerously imbalanced load, as his C-130 had lost over 4,000 pounds of fuel from one wing. Yet somehow, perhaps through a mixture of sheer nerve and skill, Cole got the aircraft into the air. They limped their way back to Cam Ranh Bay, where ground crews would later count over 85 bullet and shrapnel holes in the fuselage. On board were just 4 passengers, 2 enlisted men from the combat control team, their commander Major John Gallagher and the air liaison officer Captain Willard Johnson. The 2 enlisted men, Technical Sergeant Morton Friedman and Staff Sergeant James Lundy, had fiercely protested leaving, believing their mission wasn't over. Even if the fixed-wing evacuations had stopped, airdrops would be critical and someone would need to be on the ground to direct them. Friedman and Lundy, along with their team lead Major Gallagher, who, though not a controller himself, was a C-130 pilot assigned as mission commander, standard protocol to place the commissioned officer over enlisted men, had arrived at Kham Duc expecting a routine assignment, when the 3-man combat control team, call sign Tailpipe, touched down on May 10, 1968. Their mission was simple: keep air traffic flowing in and out of the airstrip, choosing approaches, advising pilots on hazards, and speeding up the offloads to minimize how long aircraft remain exposed on the runway. But within minutes of arriving, it was clear that nothing about the next 3 days would be routine. Almost immediately, as soon as their boots touched the ground, a mortar destroyed their trailer that was packed with their vital equipment, radios, weapons and tools. Minutes later, another shell landed nearby. They took cover in a ditch that would become their refuge over the next coming days. But whenever the mortars stopped, Friedman and Lundy were back on their feet, out in the open, directing aircraft through increasingly dangerous conditions. At times, there were multiple aircraft ready to depart or stacked overhead waiting to land. Well, the team managed this flow with only a fraction of the equipment they'd normally have. Still, between May the 10th and May the 12th, they directed dozens of aircraft in and out of the camp. They didn't have time to worry about comfort or safety. On the first day alone, a 3-round mortar strike nearly destroyed their primary radio jeep. Friedman ordered it moved immediately and had barely moved 10 meters before another round hit its previous position. The blast knocked both controllers to the ground, but uninjured they got back up. Eventually, even the jeep and its equipment was lost to enemy fire. Lundy broke his hand trying to recover gear from the wrecked trailer. A Special Forces medic urged him to evacuate. The break was bad enough to justify it, but Lundy refused. He considered himself too critical to leave. Still, Gallagher, their commanding officer, ordered them to board Cole's aircraft, believing that there'd be no further evacuations via C-130 or C-123s, plus most of their gear was gone. Reluctantly they complied, unaware that later that same day, they would become part of one of the most remarkable rescue missions of the war. By midday, just 145 people had been evacuated from Kham Duc, 76 by helicopter and 69 between Cole's C-130 and Shelton's C-123. But the day was far from over, and the cost was already mounting. Aircraft had been lost, many more badly damaged, and the skies over Kham Duc remained a gauntlet of enemy fire. Yet the pilots, fully aware of the danger that each landing could be their last, kept flying into the fire, because down there people were still waiting, and the enemy was closing in, and under no circumstances could American personnel be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Not just for their lives, but what their capture would mean. A propaganda coup on the eve of the Paris peace talks. Despite that resolve, the price of escape from Kham Duc would only climb higher as the afternoon wore on. I want to take a second here to thank you so much for watching. I'm truly grateful to share my love of aviation with fellow enthusiasts like you. So if you're enjoying this story, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference in helping me reach more aviation fans. Now let's get back to the story. After Major Ray Shelton and Lieutenant Colonel Cole had gotten away, there was a long, brutal delay with many more hundreds of people still trapped and waiting. It was only at 13:50, nearly 3 hours after Cole's departure, that MACV reversed the orders to cancel the evacuation and ordered the 800th and 34th to resume extractions using both C-130s and C-123s. There was no other option. Although helicopters were able to get in and evacuate few people and some wounded, to get all the people away in time before the base was overrun, the big transports would have to go back in. The sudden change from resupply to full evacuation caught many of the aircrews off guard. Some were already airborne or loaded for airdrops, and now they had to return to base, dumping cargo and scrambling to adapt as the orders shifted. The time-consuming process of rigging and unrigging loads delayed critical missions. One experienced aircraft commander described the chaos as a ship without a rudder, noting that confusion reigned supreme. At Kham Duc, Special Forces leaders, having known about the evacuation since midnight, began organising the withdrawal to maintain order among the irregular troops. They planned to evacuate dependents first, followed by the irregulars, engineers and the American Division personnel, with Special Forces staying behind to ensure discipline. However, conflicting orders from generals directed that all Americans be evacuated first, leaving the indigenous CIDG forces for last. But commanders on the ground, fearing that this would cause panic and be seen as abandonment by the Vietnamese, refused to comply. Believing that they, the Special Forces, were the vital link between US and local troops, they depended on their own decisions to prevent chaos. It wasn't until 1500 hours that another attempt by C-130 was made. A Hercules piloted by Major Bernard Bucher from Mactan Air Base in the Philippines was ordered in, despite knowing that no C-130 had successfully evacuated Kham Duc that day. As his aircraft came in low over the ridge approaching from the southwest, it was struck repeatedly by enemy fire. He reported his fuselage taking multiple hits. Bucher managed to land and quickly filled a cargo hold with CIDG personnel and Vietnamese civilians, most of them women and children, packed shoulder to shoulder in the vast rattling metal bay. Bucher then taxied back to the southwest end of the runway, turned around and backed up as far as he could. With the engines throwing up a huge cloud of red dust, the aircraft accelerated down the runway, taking off towards the northeast. Unlike the helicopters, which turned west after takeoff, Bucher continued in a straight climb, right past his fighter escort and directly into the sights of two machine guns positioned on a knoll north of the runway. Moments later, he reported taking heavy ground fire just before the right wing exploded and folded upward. The C-130 never made it more than a mile from the runway. It crashed into a ravine. No explosion, just a slow rising column of black smoke. There were no survivors. 183 lives ended maybe less than a mile from safety, Vietnamese civilians and families among those killed. Special Forces Captain Warren Orr and the entire 5-man crew, Major Bernard Bucher, Major John McElroy, First Lieutenant Stephen Morland, Staff Sergeant Frank Hepler, and Airman First Class George Long. Captain Spear, who had been the first FAC on station in the morning, saw the gunfire that brought Bucher down, immediately calling in an airstrike. Less than a minute, a fighter bomber destroyed the guns, but it was too late for Bucher. Overhead, Lieutenant Colonel William Boyd had just watched the entire scene unfold. Now, it was his turn to attempt the rescue. That morning, Lieutenant Colonel William Boyd and his crew had lifted off from Cam Ranh Bay in the Hercules C-130, call sign Spare 807, expecting just another routine day running supplies. They had spent the morning flying missions up and down the coast of Vietnam, just another link in the long grinding chain of the war's logistics. By the afternoon, they had landed at Chu Lai. Boyd had gone to the air control element to see his commander to let them know that he and his crew were almost done for the day and they would be returning to Cam Ranh Bay. That's when he was told about Kham Duc. something about a camp in trouble, and that he and his crew and his aircraft were to fly there, land, get as many people, and fly back to Chu Lai. As he and his crew walked back to the C-130, they ran into Major James Swain, the pilot who had been shot down in his A-1 over Kham Duc and rescued earlier that day by an army helicopter. He warned them,
"For God's sake, stay out of Kham Duc. It belongs to Charlie."
On board with him that day was co-pilot Major John Reed, navigator Captain Felix Powers, loadmaster Airman First Class Samuel Caro, and 2 flight engineers, Tech Sergeant Earl Fonderwhite and Staff Sergeant Harlan Johnson. They had no idea they'd soon be flying straight into one of the most desperate rescue missions of the entire war as they took off headed for Kham Duc. Boyd briefed his crew on the situation. From what he knew, that there was a wrecked helicopter on the runway and a burning bulldozer to the side, reducing the usable runway length to about 2,200 feet. Boyd arrived over the base, coming in low under heavy clouds, just at 3,000 feet. Enemy troops were now inside the base perimeter and moving towards the camp halfway along the runway. The sky was aswarm with F-100s, F-4s, helicopters, C-123s and O-2 forward air controllers, thick as flies, as Boyd's co-pilot Major John Reed later described it. As Boyd lined up his aircraft to come into Kham Duc, he and his crew watched Bucher's C-130 roll down the runway, struggle into the air under heavy ground fire, more intense than anyone on Boyd's crew had ever seen.
"I watched him climb over a 1,500-foot hill off the end of the runway,"
Colonel Boyd said later.
"As he went over the hill, he seemed to be hit by more tracers than I've ever seen. They came from the right side of the hill, and it appeared to me that he caught fire in the air."
The aircraft burst into flames, dropped the wing and crashed beyond the airstrip. Boyd and his crew saw this all happen, and yet they still flew in. Twice. Now on approach, Boyd kicked in the rudder and side-slipped the giant C-130 to get the maximum rate of descent to reduce his exposure to gunfire. Despite this, they started taking hits. Loadmaster Caro reported that the tail of spare 807 had been struck by ground fire. Just as Boyd was about to flare for the landing, they could see NVA troops aiming and firing at them from the perimeter. A quarter of a mile out, a 122mm rocket skipped across the runway and exploded just 100 feet in front of the aircraft. Over the radio, they could hear calls of
"Don't land,"
and
"The C-130 that just took off has been shot down."
It wasn't until that rocket exploded in front of his aircraft that he pulled back hard on the yoke, pushed open the throttles and went around for another approach. Now it meant that the enemy would have a better chance of getting him and his crew and his aircraft, but around they went. They could see the people on the ground desperate to be rescued, and having no other option, Boyd again side-slipped his massive Hercules, bringing him in on a steep, fast approach what could be their final landing. Boyd told his crew that there was a
damn good chance we won't make it, but we're going to try anyway."
As the wheels hit the ground, the scene erupted in desperation. From out of the ditches beside the runway, the enemy civilians, US Army engineers and soldiers ran for their lives, clutching children and carrying the wounded. All the while, the ground fire was relentless. The North Vietnamese were throwing everything they had at the airstrip: mortars, heavy machine guns, AK-47s fired from the jungle beyond the wire, and at one point a 122mm rocket flew over the aircraft. Overhead, American fighter bombers roared in, diving through the smoke to drop napalm, bombs and rockets in a desperate attempt to hold back the enemy. But it was a scene straight out of hell, and still the evacuation had to continue. Airman Caro opened the cargo door and ramp. "I could see firing all over the field and people rushing towards the aircraft," Caro said. "I was hoping one of those mortar rounds wouldn't come whistling in. It didn't seem like the people were getting on fast enough, and when I turned my head to look out the left side, I couldn't believe my eyes." 2 Vietnamese women, each carrying a small baby, were walking straight towards the number 1 propeller. Caro wanted to shout a warning, but he knew his voice wouldn't carry. He tried twice to jump from the aircraft, but was blocked twice by the crowd pushing to get inside the C-130. All I could do was stand there and watch those people walk right toward the prop. With a mix of relief and amazement, Caro watched as the women passed safely beneath the spinning propeller, their short stature sparing them from a certain death. Once everybody was on board, Caro signaled to Boyd and the airplane began to move. Boyd taxied the aircraft toward the southwest, the same direction Bucher had used to land, aiming to take off from runway 22 instead of runway 04, where Bucher's C-130 had been lost. He taxied as far down the strip as possible without running into the heavy enemy fire pounding the runway ahead. Then, turning the Hercules around, he immediately began a takeoff roll, calling for maximum takeoff effort, following a heading navigator Captain Powers had plotted through a ravine. As they accelerated, enemy fire tore into the plane. As somebody who witnessed this all happen later described the scene, it was receiving extremely heavy ground fire, small arms and automatic weapons, and appeared to be in the right bank and then reversed to the left. This allowed him the best terrain masking and shielded him from some ground fire. Tracer rounds struck the fuselage and left wing as Boyd's massive Hercules rocked under the assault. Without a doubt, if it weren't for Boyd's aggressive manoeuvring, his aircraft would have been claimed by the guns below. No one on Spare 807 relaxed until the Hercules reached 3,000 feet and started its return to base. At 7:30 PM, after a demanding 16-hour mission, they landed back at Cam Bay. Before leaving the aircraft, Major Reed grabbed a can of spray paint and wrote on the fuselage near the crew door, "Lucky Duck." And a lucky duck she was. Ground crews counted bullet and shrapnel holes in every part of the aircraft, the fuselage, the wings, the control surfaces. Holes riddled the sides of the cockpit and the engine nacelles. Yet, against all odds, they made it out. Boyd's crew had rescued over 100 people. It was the first miracle of the day. But even then, the nightmare wasn't over. The next C-130 wouldn't be so lucky. If the chances were slim, and they were slim to begin with, flying into Kham Duc was tantamount to flirting with death. But that didn't stop Lieutenant Colonel John Delmore. Delmore's C-130, on temporary duty from Naha Air Base in Okinawa, had flown out of Cam Bay. As he approached the runway to land, confusion reigned. Boyd was taken off directly towards him, forcing Delmore to abort and make a go-around. Also having witnessed Buca's crash, Delmore and his crew couldn't have been too excited about making a second approach, and they weren't wrong. At about 300 to 400 feet altitude, the aircraft began taking heavy fire. The crew described the sound of bullets striking the aircraft like sledgehammers hitting metal. His C-130 was taking some serious damage, with smoke starting to rise through the cockpit floor between the pilot's feet well before they reached the runway. Moments later, bullets pierced the cockpit walls, tearing 6-inch holes in the aluminium skin. Engineer Tech Sergeant John McCall saw rounds come up through the floor and punch holes in the roof. Delmore and his co-pilot struggled to maintain control, choosing to shut down all 4 engines while still on approach. Just before touchdown, one of the men had jettisoned the crew entrance door so they could escape quickly. The C-130 landed with its wheels down, but the hydraulic system had failed, leaving them without brakes and with little control over steering. The aircraft crashed into the Chinook that had been destroyed earlier that morning, and then veered off the runway, coming to a stop against a dirt mound, almost completely off the runway, but not quite. Despite being armed with only .38 caliber pistols, all 5 crew got out as quickly as they could nevertheless. Fortunately, within 20 minutes, a Marine CH-46 arrived and evacuated them from Kham Duc. By late afternoon, the runway there had turned into chaos. Smoke, debris and confusion blanketed the field, with communications all but useless and incoming fire nearly constant. Lieutenant Colonel Franklin Montgomery had already seen enough to know what he was flying into. He'd watched Delmore get hit and crash on the strip, and he'd seen Buca go down trying to get out. But even with all that in mind, Montgomery didn't hesitate. He brought his Hercules in, descending straight through tracer rounds and ground fire, landing right in the middle of it all. Montgomery's crew barely had time to drop the ramp before the crowd surged into the cargo bay. Civilians, CIDG and a handful of Americans ran for the aircraft, many of them desperate and many of them in shock. In the scramble, order collapsed. Some of the Vietnamese civilians were so panicked that they ran directly under the spinning propellers, risking instant death just to get aboard. At one point, he was knocked flat by the stampede and then sent flying again when a mortar round hit nearby, the blast throwing him hard onto the tarmac. Still, they managed to keep boarding. The crew counted more than 50 explosions, rockets, mortars hitting within shouting distance of the aircraft during the brief time they were loading people. And yet, by some combination of luck and timing, the aircraft took no direct hits. Montgomery's team packed in more than 150 people, mostly Vietnamese civilians, a few local irregulars and some remaining US personnel, and they got out fast, lifting off through the smoke as incoming fire was closing in on them. and then surprisingly things started to shift. Just after Montgomery's departure, another C-130 came in. This one loaded up around 130 people. It too managed to get back into the air without a scratch. And then another one followed. It managed to land, load and lift with 90 more evacuees safely aboard. After a day of failed landings, flaming wrecks and last-ditch attempts, it seemed for a moment at least that the tide was turning. As the final C-130 lifted off, North Vietnamese troops were breaching the perimeter, rushing to set up gun positions along the very airstrip on which 8 aircraft had been lost, with the wreckage of the C-130 sprawled across the tarmac that had reduced the usable runway length to just 2,200 feet. By late afternoon, May the 12th, there were only a handful of people left on the ground at Kham Duc. 2 American officers, Captain Philip Smotherman, a FAC pilot who had been shot down earlier that day, and a Special Forces team commander, Captain Robert Henderson, along with his men and local CIDG troops, just about enough to fill one last C-130. As the North Vietnamese closed in and mortar fire shook the base, their window for escape was narrowing by the minute. Major James Wallace flew the last C-130 into Kham Duc to take out the last group of people. Even as he was making his approach, orders were starting to ripple down the chain of command to call off further C-130 flights. The losses had been steep, and General William Momeyer was directing the Airlift Command Center to stop sending in the big transports. But the message didn't reach Wallace in time, and frankly just as well. Before the order could take effect, Wallace and his crew were already on the ground and ready to roll out with whoever was left. While they loaded up, explosions erupted across the base as the ammunition stores began to detonate, sending shockwaves through the valley and panic through the ranks, especially amongst the South Vietnamese troops, many of whom had lost family members in the early crash of Bucca's C-130. Despite taking fire during takeoff, the aircraft was unhit, a small miracle considering how close the enemy was getting. As they climbed out of the mountainous bowl surrounding Kham Duc and levelled off towards the coast, Captain Smotherman later recalled a visible shift amongst the passengers. The tension had gripped everyone on board. The expectation that this flight might end like Bucca's started to lift. Fear gave way to cautious relief. Smotherman noted that he hoped that nothing else in his tour would come close to this kind of intensity, and yet even in the chaos he never doubted they'd make it out. "There were so many good guys on our side," he wrote. "Good guys doing very difficult things." By the time Wallace's aircraft was wheels up, 8 C-130s had flown into Kham Duc on that single day. Of those, 6 managed to extract evacuees and 2 were lost entirely. 1 aircraft took out only 4 people. The remaining 5 collectively carried more than 600 men, women and children out of harm's way. Plus, earlier that morning, a lone C-123 had also managed to evacuate 65 people. By the day's end, anyone who hadn't made it out on those aircraft either escaped by helicopter or died aboard Bucca's downed Hercules. The cost of the operation was punishing. The last to leave Kham Duc were led by Lieutenant Colonel Schungel, whose men confirmed that no personnel remained before boarding. Schungel himself was the final man to step aboard a Chinook for what was supposed to be the final evacuation flight. But the day was far from over. In the fog of war and the mounting confusion, the 3-man combat control team, who had already been evacuated, were mistakenly sent back into Kham Duc to coordinate airlift operations. Unbeknownst to them, there was no one left to evacuate. Well, no one but themselves. As Major Wallace was rolling his C-130 down the runway for takeoff, the rescue operation at Kham Duc should have been finished. But in the confusion, another Hercules was inbound. This one carrying the 3 members of the combat control team who had earlier been withdrawn from the battle aboard Lieutenant Colonel Coles's C-130. They were now being sent back in, under orders from General McLaughlin, the commander of the 834th Air Division. Earlier that afternoon, McLaughlin had learned that the 3-man team had been pulled out before completing their assignment, and determined to correct that oversight, he'd ordered their immediate return to the airstrip. Lundy and Friedman hadn't wanted to leave Kham Duc in the first place, so it's no surprise they were ready to head straight back in. After arriving at Cam Ranh Bay aboard Coles's battered C-130, the team was immediately reassigned, this time to another Hercules flown by Major J. Van Cleef. That crew had only just been diverted from a different mission, touching down at Cam Ranh Bay at 12:40, and after a quick briefing they were told that Kham Duc was now too dangerous for landings and they'd be instead conducting airdrop of supplies. They were told to reposition to Da Nang, load up and drop from altitude. Engines were started and the crew was ready to taxi, but just before departure orders were changed. They were now taking 3 passengers into Kham Duc. This threw the crew. They'd just been told it was too risky to land, and now suddenly they were meant to fly people in. Out on the tarmac, the combat control team was rushed over, and Gallagher, likely frustrated already, tried to explain the situation to Van Cleef. Most of their gear had been destroyed, fixed-wing extractions had been halted, and dropping them back into the middle of a near collapse would achieve very little. As they taxied out, Gallagher radioed his command, urging them to reconsider, but the orders were to go in. Then he got onto Hilda, the airlift command in Saigon, but the reply was to the point: stop tying up the frequency. That was it. No time left to argue. They lifted off just after 1500 hours and arrived over Kham Duc around 1620. The orders hadn't changed and now it was too late. As they made their approach, they watched another C-130 roar down the runway and climb out. The last evacuation flight out of the camp. But no one quite knew that yet. Certainly not Van Cleef, his crew, or the 3-man team. The 3 men disembarked, telling the crew to wait 2 minutes, and they ran towards the Special Forces compound looking for people to evacuate. The aircrew waited on the ground for about 5 minutes, expecting them to return with survivors, but no one came back, because there was simply no one left to take. While they waited, the mortar rounds began to creep closer, and before long tracer fire and machine gun bursts were walking in towards the aircraft. With the base falling around them and no idea what came next, they made a call to save the aircraft and took off empty, leaving the combat control team behind. Arab 03, flown by Major Todd, had conducted a high-speed, low-level visual reconnaissance of the airstrip to confirm that no troops remained in sight. While Major Todd was on the lookout for possible evacuees, Van Cleef C-130 had touched down at the opposite end of the runway, deposited the men and had taken off. Unaware that the 3 men had been deposited, Arab 03 made a radio call stating that the base could now be destroyed at will. However, Van Cleef, now in the air, immediately grabbed the radio shouting negative, negative, and explained with plenty of expletives that he had just inserted the 3-man team into Kham Duc. Up until that moment, the airwaves had been a mess. Fighters, forward air controllers, the ABCCC and transport crews all talking over one another, each trying to solve their own problems in real time as the situation changed by the second. It is said that when Van Cleef shouted over the radio, the airwaves fell silent. Everyone listening knew instantly what it meant. On the ground, after finding nobody at the Special Forces compound, the 3 men began searching the rest of the base, looking in one building after another. First confused, where were those who they had been sent in to rescue? Then the sickening realization dawned on them. They were on the base alone, and that the enemy was quickly closing in on them. And to make matters worse, Friedman's emergency UHF radio was disabled, leaving them with no way to call for help. Now stranded and surrounded, Major John Gallagher, Tech Sergeant Mort Friedman and Sergeant Jim Lundy had taken cover in a shallow ditch beside the runway. Armed only with their M16s and 38 revolvers, they exchanged fire with the North Vietnamese, who had placed 3 50 caliber machine guns along the runway. One of them had dug in beneath the wing of Delmore's wrecked C-130. Pinned and isolated, they returned fire in short, controlled bursts to keep the enemy's heads down. Caught in a moment thick with desperation, Friedman turned to Lundy and handed over his wallet stuffed with cash and told him to make sure his wife got it. He didn't want the North Vietnamese to end up with it, and in that split second with the chaos closing in, that detail seemed to matter. Friedman opened fire on a nearby machine gun nest tucked in beneath the wing of Delmore's C-130, and one of the gunners dropped after a burst from his M16. But on the far side of the runway, a second gun position kept laying down fire, and to make matters worse, a group of enemy soldiers had begun moving in from the far western end, closing the distance with every step. Friedman, Lundy and Gallagher were fairly certain that no pilot would try landing at Kham Duc now, not with enemy troops already on the runway and with the ammo dumps going up in the background. What made things even more uncertain was that Friedman hadn't even been able to make radio contact with any aircraft overhead, so no one could confirm if the combat control team was still alive. While several FACs made low passes over the runway to see if they could spot the men, a call went out for the next aircraft in the hold over Kham Duc to land and rescue the team. The next aircraft in line was flown by Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Janot in his C-130 callsign Bookie 750. Without hesitating, he throttled back and put his aircraft into a steep, high-speed sideslip, with fighters on each wingtip following him down to lay down suppressing fire. Nevertheless, Janot landed amidst chaos, with bullets whistling through the air striking the runway by their aircraft as they taxied. But with the thick black smoke from a detonated ammo dump now rolling across the runway, cloaking everything in a swirling haze, making spotting the stranded men nearly impossible. Not seeing them, he applied full power to take off, but just as the aircraft rolled past the ditch in which the three men had earlier taken shelter, they sprung out, running towards the now departing C-123, waving their arms and shouting. As they climbed away, one of the crew happened to glance back, just in time to see the three figures jump back into the ditch. Years later, Jim Lundy would recall the moment. A transport landed, but the pilot didn't see anyone left on the ground, so he took off. We figured that no one would come back. We had two choices: either be taken prisoner or fight it out. There was no doubt about it. We had 11 magazines among us, and we were going to take as many of them as we could. Janot's heart dropped when his crew told him they had spotted the men. He called over the radio to declare that he would go around and try again. But then he noticed that he was critically low on fuel and wouldn't have enough to make another assault takeoff. He quickly relayed their position over the radio, hoping that the following aircraft in line could get them before it was too late. The three men on the ground thought they were done for. Friedman later said, "The thought of another plane was impossible and illogical because the NVA were moving all around us. So much ammo was blowing up you couldn't tell incoming from our own, and it was throwing debris all over the runway. Even if they knew we were here, no man in his right mind would attempt a landing. I've never felt so lonely in all my life." Amid this mess was Lieutenant Colonel Joe Jackson in his C-123 Provider. Jackson was a 45-year-old who had dreamt of flying from an early age, enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941 when he was just 18, becoming a crew chief on B-25 bombers, earning his commission and wings, and then becoming a gunner instructor. He then flew P-40 and P-63 fighters and, towards the end of World War II, B-24 bombers. During the Korean War, he returned to flying, completing 107 combat missions in F-84s, earning himself a Distinguished Flying Cross. After Korea, during the Cold War, he'd even piloted the U-2, so he was definitely no novice. Vietnam would be his fourth war, one for which he had volunteered. That day, Jackson, commander of a detachment at Da Nang, had taken off at 7 AM in a C-123K serial 554542 for his semi-annual check flight. Major Jesse Campbell, an instructor pilot and flight examiner, was in a co-pilot seat. He too was a man with much valuable experience in the C-123, having flown routinely into Khe Sanh during its darkest days. Jackson had scheduled a check ride with a routine cargo run up and down the coast to various locations. But that afternoon they were called back to Da Nang for diversion to the evacuation at Kham Duc. Back at base they grabbed flak jackets and extra ammo for their 38s and one more M16, topped off their fuel, then lifted off for Kham Duc at 2:55 PM. When Jackson arrived over Kham Duc, call sign Bookie 771, he checked in with Hillsborough, a C-130 command post orbiting overhead, and was told to join the stack with the rest of the aircraft circling the burning base. Jackson and his crew were over Kham Duc at 9,000 feet when they heard the call asking if anyone could go in and get the three men. Both he and Campbell had seen what had happened. They were fully aware of the extreme dangers. Even though they had just watched the enemy gunners blaze away at Janot, they, without hesitation, were ready to go next. Campbell radioed to Hillsborough, "Roger, we're going in." No textbook approach was going to cut it. This was going to be an assault landing and then some. With anti-aircraft fire coming in from every angle, Jackson would have to literally drop almost vertically into Kham Duc. So with that, he chopped the throttles, dropped the gear and called for flaps to be lowered to the assault landing angle of 55 degrees. He pushed the propellers to full forward pitch, putting them broadside against the airstream. Everything was hanging out to create as much drag as possible. At the same time, he briefed the crew on their tasks. Flight engineer Tech Sergeant Edward Trejo was to keep the 2 auxiliary jet engines started and left idling. They'd need the extra thrust on takeoff. His instructions to Major Campbell in the right seat were to make sure the flaps were back up before they took off, and for Staff Sergeant Mason Grubbs, the C-123 Loadmaster, that the rear doors would be opened as soon as they touched down and to pull the combat control team into the airplane as soon as they got within reach. With her nose pitched steeply down, falling from 9,000 feet like a barn door, the view through the windscreen was nothing but jungle. Both Jackson and Campbell had to glance up through the overhead windows just to make sure they were still on course. Bookie 77 was literally falling out of the sky. The big bird groaned and shuddered as she plummeted through the smoke and flak toward the shattered runway at 4,500 feet per minute, with every rivet rattling and straining to hold the old girl together, all the while bullets and white-hot cannon shells whizzed by. The provider was never meant to drop in at 155 miles an hour. On paper, the flap shouldn't even hold. The pressure in the blow-up valve was supposed to kick in, forcing them back up to save damage to the system. Knowing this, Jackson told Trejo to be especially mindful of that. If the flaps came up at all, the aircraft might overshoot, a disaster they couldn't afford. But this time, somehow, the flaps held. On the way down, Jackson talked to Janot about the location of the 3 men. He intended to taxi right up to them. As they were fast approaching the ground, Jackson heaved back on the yoke, braking the rapid descent, leveling out at just 50 feet and a quarter of a mile away from the runway. They just couldn't afford to overshoot this landing. The 3 men in the ditch were close to despair when Gallagher said, "There's a 123 on short final." Jackson landed fast, standing on the brakes, unable to reverse the propellers, as doing so would automatically shut off the 2 jet engines. The C-123 skidded to a stop, almost to the wreckage of the CH-47 helicopter, avoiding all the potholes and somehow managing not to puncture any tyres, their dramatic and unorthodox arrival having taken everyone by surprise, even the North Vietnamese who had not been firing on her. "It didn't seem like there was any possible way for a plane to get in," Lundy said. "The whole camp was burning and exploding. When I looked up and I saw that C-123 coming in, it was like a miracle. I couldn't believe it." But the element of surprise didn't last long. Gunners in the hills quickly zeroed in, their rounds smacking into the runway and ricocheting beneath the aircraft, skipping out the other side. This photo shows Jackson's C-123 on the runway at Kham Duc, seconds before the 3 men climbed aboard. The only time a Medal of Honor action was ever caught on film up until then. The 3 men, clutching M16s, firing at the enemy as they ran, were grabbed by Grubbs and Trejo, who managed to drag all 3 men aboard, but just as they did, Campbell shouted a warning, "Look out!" Down the runway, headed directly towards them, came a 122mm rocket, fired from the ridgeline just beyond the northern end of the strip. It tore towards them with little time to react. As we were beginning to take off, a 122mm rocket came straight at us, Campbell later recalled. But its trajectory was too low, and it glanced off the tarmac and spun several times like a bottle before stopping just a few feet from the nose of our plane. Luckily, it didn't explode. It was a dud, what Jackson later called dumb luck. He taxied gingerly around the rocket, now bent in a horseshoe shape. He then ran up the throttles on the twin radials and a pair of J-85 jets wide open, taking off in about 1,000 feet into a steep climb. 15 seconds after the C-123 started rolling, mortars exploded on the exact spot where they had just been parked. Jackson figured the round had probably been in the air for about 40 seconds, meaning they'd gotten out by the skin of their teeth. In all, from the moment they touched down at 1646, Bookie 771 had been on the ground for less than a minute. Still, it was the longest fraction of a minute in the combat controllers' and air crews' lives. During the whole rescue, the usual radio chatter had gone deathly silent. No one above talked, everyone held their breath. Once in the air, one of the men who they just rescued was heard to say over the intercom, We thought we were dead, and then we were alive. When they got back to Da Nang, they checked the entire aircraft expecting the worst. By some miracle, Bookie 771, despite the enemy having fired at them while they were descending, while they were on the runway, and also on takeoff, they had managed to come away without a scratch, not a single bullet hole. It was nothing short of a miracle. It just so happened that the 12th of May 1968 was also Mother's Day. On January 16, 1969, President Lyndon Johnson awarded Jackson the Medal of Honor, citing his gallantry, a moment captured in a grainy black and white photo. Jackson finished his tour in Vietnam in August of that year with 298 combat sorties and was the only airlift crew member to win a Medal of Honor during the Vietnam War. Co-pilot Campbell received the Air Force Cross for his role in a daring rescue. Crew members Trejo and Grubbs were awarded a Silver Star. Others who fought to pull people out of Kham Duc were recognized as well. Major Bucher, who perished when his C-130 was shot down, was posthumously awarded the Air Force Cross, along with Boyd, the pilot of Lockheed Duc, and Janot, who made the first attempt to extract the stranded combat controllers. Cole, the pilot of the first C-130 to fly into Kham Duc, and who had pulled off a takeoff with a blown tyre and leaking fuel tanks, was awarded the Silver Star. He also received the prestigious Mackay Trophy, recognizing his efforts as one of the most meritorious flights of the year. As for the C-123, the slow, noisy beast had managed to pull off a miraculous rescue in broad daylight under NVA guns. This was no small thing for an old mule. And Jackson, he passed his flight test.